He had waited 37 years to be believed, and the thing that finally made them listen was a light that spoke. Dennis Reeves had spent most of his adult life in rooms that smelled of dust and old coffee, surrounded by maps and carbon copies of half-forgotten excavation reports. He could recite the dimensions of a mastaba in his sleep. He knew the peculiar grain of Nile mud and where to prod a broken faience bead to learn its kiln age. He had written papers that made editors nod and readers yawn. He had argued at conferences and been applauded politely while opportunities slid past him like river silt. He had been right enough to be dangerous to himself and wrong enough to be irrelevant to others. That combination left him thin and tenacious, in a way kindness sometimes mistook for stubbornness. A single paragraph, then a small request. If this story touches something alive in you, consider subscribing and enabling notifications. There is more to follow, and what comes next is offered for those following the trail. The city around him in Tempe was ordinary in the way a withheld truth is ordinary. Lamplight through blinds, the muffled thrum of traffic, the refrigerator's low complaint. He lived in a narrow house cluttered with postcards sent by students who had found work and planned marriages. Between them were pages torn from journals, annotated with marginalia that had become the outlines of his life. There were photographs of the Giza Plateau taken on cheap camera film in 1994, when his hands were steadier and his certainty less worn. A chipped cup on the desk still bore, in dried stain, the last coffee he had drunk after failing to secure tenure. That failure had not knocked him to the ground. It had done a subtler thing. It taught him how to keep moving, how to keep registering the small registers of evidence that the institution called flattering and the world called trivia. It taught him how to sleep badly and work well at 2 in the morning, working through catalogs, spinning possibilities out of erosions in carved stone, and tracing the lines, always, the lines that seemed to map a pattern across time. His obsession had a name that made colleagues smile: Atlantis. To some it was a myth, to many a metaphor, to his enemies a sign of sloppy reasoning. To Dennis it was a pattern of displacement, sedimentary layers of memory encoded in architecture, a network of centers of attention that had once been arranged with such precise aim that later builders copied the geometry but lost the music. If the pyramids were stones that remembered, Atlantis, if it had been more than myth, was the city that had taught stones to remember. He had published notes on alignment and waterworks that bristled with cautious language and hedged implusions. A popular magazine ran a short piece framing his ideas as hobbyist curiosity. A senior academic had called him romantic at a faculty meeting and, with a narrow smile, walked away. The grant boards, patrolled by committees with unreckoned appetite for doubt, denied him funds. Students who admired him joined better-funded labs. He learned the economy of invisibility. Speak softly, publish, repeat. If denied, find other means. On a damp spring night he was alone in his study, under a light that threw a small pool of yellow over maps. Rain had washed the city clean. The windows beaded as if the air could not decide whether to keep the outside or give it up. A battered globe sat like a forgotten planet on his shelf. He had been awake a long while, reading a line in a 19th-century traveler's diary about a capstone that burned with a quiet noon. Such phrases had been for him the tremors that announced a deeper ground. The house settled. The heater clicked. Then, in the exact center of silence where a scholar's patience balances precariously, there was a sound not of this room. A note, low and pure, as if the air itself had been plucked like a string. Dennis stiffened. The sound did not come from a speaker. It came from behind his sternum, from a place he had never given a name. The light arrived without fanfare. It was not the white glare of bulbs, nor the orange of sodium streetlights. It was blue, an inner blue that seemed to be breathing at a slow, deliberate tempo. It pooled on the floorboards and then rose to sit in the air before him like a suspended thought.
The pool did not reflect. It was the reflection. It hummed with a frequency that tasted in his mouth like salt and copper. The alien said telepathically, "We will show you how they made a city sing." The voice was not voice. It settled directly into images, not words, and then into a language he could parse. A scent of papyrus older than the papyrus he had handled. A pressure like approaching tide. A geometry of light that asked him to tilt his head and follow. Dennis could have run. He could have laughed and written the experience off as stress and sleep deprivation and late coffee grinding at the back of his molars. He did not. There was the scholar's hunger, an inextinguishable curiosity that prefaced his life's choices. And there was a weaker human thing, the taste of vindication. The light carried an assurance that felt like the answer to a question he had not yet learned how to ask. They met in Egypt 3 days later, though he could not have explained the logistics that made it so. The plane had been booked with money he did not have. His passport had been renewed the week before under a bureaucratic mercy. He arrived at night, the air of Cairo a warm sheet. In daylight, the city would be the city, layered in its modern ordinary. At night, it was the beginning of thresholds. He went south on a train that felt like it belonged to an earlier century, the windows fogged with the breath of passengers and the smell of spice and diesel. He slept fitfully, waking at odd hours to landscapes of sand that rolled to the horizon like breath.
The first vision took him back before history had been written with ink. It began with the sound, the same low, crystalline tone, and a sensation of standing at the edge of a harbor that had no water. The ground itself seemed to hold a memory of tides. In the vision, there were men and hands, and they moved with a coordination that was not the coordination of labor, but of ritual. Pulleys, ropes, and men were present but subordinate to something else. The real motion came from light shaped into vector lines that told stones where to go. He saw the builders as a chorus, not as solitary authors. They moved in sequences keyed by a frequency that made flint and granite hum like strings. The Anunnaki, if that was the name for them, appeared not as capricious gods, but as engineers of consciousness. They did not merely haul blocks, they tuned them. Their instruments were not cranes alone, but crystalline matrices and filaments tuned to specific vibrational signatures, 432 Hz resonances threaded through bronze pipes that altered the very bonding of stone to stone. The stones in that time fit not because of brute force, but because they were coaxed into alignment by patterns of pressure and song. The alien said telepathically, "They taught the stones to listen. The city was a lesson in tuned attention." Dennis felt the pull of the Nile then, not the slow brown of a river on maps, but a wide pulse, carrying resonances like slow drums beneath its flow. The city, this city that might be called Atlantis in some later tongue, was nested within channels that mirrored the human chest. Water was not merely supply, it was circuit. It fed basins that acted as capacitors, washing frequencies across stone faces to wake inscriptions carved in angles no eye alone could read. The capstone of the central temple threw light back like a finger pointing. At certain moments, when the sun or an engineered light struck it, reflections braided into patterns that shifted consciousness. Dennis's body remembered the taste of dust from an excavation he had done decades earlier. He remembered the exact ache in his wrist when he paused to rub it. In the vision, he tasted the same dust, but it was suffused with salt and ozone. He saw the gold capstone glint and thought of a line he had read as a graduate student. The apex returns the soul. The image now had weight. The capstone did not merely crown, it completed a circuit. The builders, Anunnaki, moved with a pedagogy that required readiness. They opened chambers that acted like curriculum modules. Initiates entered one by one to experience geometric sequences of light and water and sound. After each initiation, a person's habits loosened and new attentions grew. The city, in short, was an initiatory machine, architecture designed to transform perception. The alien said telepathically, "They did not merely inhabit, they remedied, they tuned." Dennis had always been careful with his metaphors. Now his metaphors were literalized. In the vision, he watched a woman place her hand on a stone and feel a memory like a ripple climb her arm. He saw the Sphinx not as a guardian, but as a test, a living index of animal instinct and disciplined mind. The body of a lion with a human face that tracked the resonance of passerby and adjusted its gaze until only those who matched the city's pitch could enter deeper. They had been teachers in a way that troubled his sense of distant antiquity. The Anunnaki, builders and tutors, worked with physics like carpenters work with wood. But they were selective. The city sang for those who were ready. For those who were not, the city was protective, deflective, sometimes indifferent. It was a conservatory and a conservator. It nurtured certain lines of consciousness while letting others erode. "What happened to them?" he asked, inside the vision, aloud and to no one. He heard the sound of his voice drag and thin. The alien said telepathically, "They did not leave because of failure. They left because the instrument had to be preserved. When attention turns to possession rather than resonance, the circuits must close." In the vision, the city folded itself in stages. There was a graceful, engineered decline, a letting go that was not collapse but careful shutdown. The Anunnaki withdrew certain frequencies, sealed hydraulic channels, and embedded codes in stone that would persist as ghost operations waiting for future ears to be tuned again. They left behind architecture that could awaken, should the conditions be right, and inscriptions that taught how to hold a vibrational line. Dennis woke in a small, bright room of a guest house by the Nile, his mouth tasting of metal and desert. A cup of tea steamed on the bedside table. He was, in the first minutes, embarrassed at his response. The scholar's worry that sleep had simply collapsed his mental faculties into cinematic memory. Then the apology he thought to make to himself changed into a careful curiosity. The images had been precise. He could trace angles in his mind and match them to drawings kept under his desk at home. He had seen tessellations that matched a plan of a temple he had measured in his 20s. Back in Tempe a week later, with airline meals feeling like a dim memory, and the guest house's sound of distant prayer like an echo inside him, he began to write. He mapped the vision against archaeology, the way one fits a fossil into a pre-existing skeleton. The alignments were uncanny. Where his colleagues had seen coincidence, he now recognized a lexicon. It was not that the ancients had known modern physics. It was that they had arranged experience through repetition, geometry, and sound in ways that altered attention. The technology was as much cultural as mechanical, ritual, placement, song. He described the first of the 3 layers aloud to no one in particular, testing the words. "Layer 1, he said into the kitchen, is construction as pedagogy. Stones as notations, water as circuit." He found himself using numbers because numbers had the authority of clarity. He outlined a sequence in a battered notebook: construction era, golden age of initiation, present-day residual activation. He numbered the stages not to finalize them, but to hold them steady. The institution did not receive this with the grace he had hoped. A post on an online forum called his ideas romantic pseudoscience. An email from an old colleague offered a polite reminder that correlation is not causation. He was used to the thrum of dismissal. It had been the soundtrack of his life. Yet there was another current now, a quieter set of messages, from people who had felt supported by what he described. Private notes arrived.
I had a dream of water that smelled like copper. I thought of Atlantis. Others sent photographs, unexpected alignments in local monuments, a child's drawing that echoed the gold capstone silhouette. It was not the outside chatter that sustained him so much as the growing coherence inside his head. The visions were not isolated. They stacked like plates returning to a cupboard. Similar patterns, repeated symbols, a voice that did not argue but clarified. On a humid evening in late summer, sitting on his narrow porch with a thermos of tea cooling at his elbow, Dennis experienced the second layer. It arrived when the air around him shivered with a note he had begun to recognize as the city's tuning. He closed his eyes and saw the gilded interior of a temple, not the outer stone, but a room that seemed grown from the inside out. Light came in filigrees and hammered the stone until it sang. Crystals hung like lamps, each carved to hold a tone. A person's body lay calm on a stone slab, while attendants braided cords around the temples, not with rope, but with light. The alien said telepathically, "Initiation moves attention from doing to listening. The mechanism is a corridor of experience." What he perceived in that corridor was not miraculous in the supernatural trick sense. It was precise in the way that mathematics can be precise. A sequence of tones at 432 Hz bathed the chest of the initiate, and with each tone a memory loosened. The memory did not leave, but rearranged itself, so that previously tight patterns of fear dissolved into a more porous architecture. The pineal, he recognized the language despite himself, did not suddenly cure him of everything. Rather, he felt its image, a suction, a small opening toward internal horizon. He knew the rules from his readings. Mystics have always described inner light, but here the teaching framed them as an engineered progression. The initiatory practice, as Dennis saw it, did not promise immortality or invulnerability. It promised a recalibration, fewer reactive sparks, a more integrated nervous economy. People who underwent the process became steadier, more able to hold attention for longer durations. The city rewarded those who could be still.
There were caveats in the vision that felt like moral contours. Not everyone who entered awakened. There were thresholds of readiness, and the city, in its prudence, would not override a soul's choice. The Anunnaki, he saw again their hands, unornamented, were not tyrants. They closed doors when greed surfaced. They concealed mechanisms when culture threatened to degrade into dominance. The alien said telepathically, "Being taught is different from being possessed." They preserved the distinction. Dennis felt flashes of grief then, brief, non-theatrical, because he understood the leaving as a kind of love. The builders had not abandoned so much as they had protected. To preserve a pattern, sometimes one must withdraw attention from those who would commodify it. The withdrawal looked from the outside like loss. Inside, it read like repair. He wrote more. He spoke cautiously to a small group of seekers he had met online, people with slow, patient sentences and photographs of stars in their backyards. He described the three-layer architecture as best he could, using words like tuning, capacitance, and initiation with a soft voice. He was careful not to claim omniscience. These were his experiences. This was his interpretation. The posts drew more attention than his footnoted papers ever had. Some messages were angry. "You're romanticizing colonizers," one commenter wrote, not entirely without cause. Others were tender. "I have been waiting for a voice like this." A handful sent donations he did not expect, small amounts that paid for another plane ticket, another guest house, another night of following the current south. The third layer arrived in a place he did not expect, a shabby temple on the edge of a modern town, where an old priest kept a lamp that never seemed to die. He had gone to see the Sphinx in a season when tourists were fewer. The light that touched that stone was low and decisive. He felt the hierarchy of thresholds again. The first two layers were about the city acting as teacher,
The third was the city as a sleeper, a residual system that still hummed if you listened. In the third layer, the city existed as a network of faint currents. The great works still conveyed partial functions. A well might still carry a frequency that made certain plants flourish. A carved niche might still activate a small wave of calm in a person who washed their hands there. The Anunnaki had not left an inert ruin, but a field of latent operations. Its integrity depended on the ratio of attention to noise. In certain moments, sunrise at the equinox, the correct pitch struck by a quartz instrument, the residual systems would flare and perform mini awakenings. Those were the times Dennis began to chase in earnest. He learned to listen in the field. He walked the plateau in the early morning, when humidity lay like a veil. He took a small tuning fork his students had joked about and struck it. It sang, thin and true, and a hairline of recognition moved through the air. People nearby looked over, curious. A child laughed. The stone seemed, he could not name the mechanism, less inert. It responded. It did not speak in words, it shifted. The alien said telepathically, "Residual is not broken, it is asleep." He became a bridge by accident. A few who heard his talks felt a pull toward pilgrimage. A handful more wrote that they had felt something at dawn by a canal, that a worry they had carried for years had loosened. Dennis emphasized the natural limits. This was not a cure-all. This was an invitation to practice listening, to recalibrate attention. He offered exercises, short, bounded practices centered on breath, sound at 432 Hz, and careful approach to stone. He cautioned against sensationalizing the mechanisms. He called them tools. A list came together then in his notebook, an emergent taxonomy of insights so clear in its order that even his skeptical friends could not help but read it. He framed them for himself as 5 truths, because 5 felt like a number that could hold a pattern without pretending to close it. He read them aloud, once in the quiet kitchen, the words clumsy and sacred at once. 1, he said, architecture is pedagogy. The arrangement of space shapes attention. 2, frequency is a controller and a liberator. The tones they used were specific. They tuned for what we now call presence. 3, water is circuit. Channels and basins were not merely supply, they were active components. 4, initiation is gradual. Not everyone is ready, and readiness is not moral, it is capacity. 5, preservation sometimes looks like abandonment. They closed what they had to close. These were not pronouncements meant to settle debate. They were working hypotheses, scaffolds for a practice he would later teach and then refine with others. He wanted readers to think in terms of attention rather than ownership, of calibration rather than cure. The 5 truths were an invitation to look at ruins as texts that could be read by disciplined listening. It was in that posture, careful, open-handed, that the matter of Atlantis itself fell into a new light. The city in his visions had not sat on a single island in the middle of nowhere. It was a hub, a lattice of attention nodes, anchored by water and geometric relationships. Atlantis, as later myths would call it, had been less a physical place than a configuration of functions. When the Anunnaki left, they did not vanish. They rerouted the functions and embedded instructions in stone. Over centuries, languages shifted and the image froze into myth when the apparatus went offline. There was, he sensed, a moral complexity here. The builders had not made a perfect world. They had made an environment that selected for certain ways of being. That selection had consequences. Those consequences had likely included inequality, as any potent tool tends to be unevenly distributed. The Anunnaki's solution was to step back, to quiet the city rather than let its instrumentality be abused. In the vision, he did not see vengeance. He saw a restraint that read like stewardship.
Not everyone accepted this reading. Outside, the debates roared. There were podcasts and panels that flung insults like confetti, threads that accused him of fantasy. Inside, those who had felt a shift wrote messages that read like confessions. "I stopped waking at 3 in the morning," one woman wrote. "My hands stopped trembling when I hold my child." Dennis did not make claims about healing. He repeated his 5 truths and added exercises of listening. He recommended nothing that required medical intervention. He offered a path for attention. The more he shared, the more his life shifted in small, true ways. People began to come to Tempe, not in numbers that would interest the mainstream press, but enough to make his neighbors smile and say, "Seems you finally got an audience, Dennis." They arrived with backpacks and careful questions. They sat on his floor, drank tea, and listened as he unfolded the 3 layers. They asked about the Anunnaki with reverence and skepticism in equal measure. They wanted to know how one tuned a stone, or whether the Sphinx really watched differently when you struck a note. He answered with humility. You listen, and you see what listens back. He planned a return to Egypt with a small group. Not organized pilgrimage, but a deliberate journey to test the residual activations and study the architecture's hints. He had the money by then, nicked together from small donations and his own cautious savings. There was urgency yet, not because of any impending catastrophe, but because each year without a practiced attention made awakening more difficult. Mud and sun and human turnover bury many things. On the night before the planned departure, as he packed a small case with a tuning fork, some notebooks, a worn scarf, his sleep arrived thin and restless. He awoke to the familiar pressure inside his skull, that note that had become akin to a heartbeat. The room filled with the blue breathing light again, this time denser, as if it had mass. The voice entered not as an explanation, but as an appointment, concise, sober, intimate. The alien said telepathically, "The sarcophagus holds a sequence. It is not a relic, it is a receptacle. You will be asked to become a conduit." Dennis felt the phrase in his throat like a question. He understood conduit as ordinary tech term, but the context made it feel like a vocation. "Why me?" he asked aloud. His voice betrayed nothing of the years he had spent in quiet preparation. Why choose a man who published footnotes and lived on coffee? The alien said telepathically, "You learned to listen in absence. You kept pattern names when others erased them. That readiness is a thread." He nodded, the motion automatic, like a man making peace with an appointment he had long anticipated but feared. The sarcophagus. He had studied examples, ornate and plain. He had catalogued types, measured interior spaces. In his vision, the sarcophagus did not open to glory, but to a careful geometry, an inner chamber that would cradle a person and surround them with circuits of stone and water and tone. He prepared for what he could, the tuning fork, the small quartz crystal he had carried since youth, a copy of his 5 truths, written in a hand that surprised him with its steadiness. He would not be a prophet. He would be a witness, willing to enter a device that might change him. He did not imagine levitation or cinematic rapture. He imagined a collapse of protective habits and the emergence of a quieter attention. He left for Cairo with the light's memory warming him. In the airport, amid the commerce of departure, he felt the strangeness of being a man with an appointment, with an apparatus from a dream that also might be a device. He thought of the Anunnaki as engineers who loved their work enough to close it when it was becoming harmful. He thought of the Sphinx as a mechanism of balance. He thought, too, of those who would never come, who would see his work as fantasy and choose their ordinary certainties instead. The plane lifted. Below, the city lights blurred into rivers of orange. Above, the stars were correct and indifferent.
He held the quartz crystal in his palm and felt for the first time not only the pull of a personal vindication, but the shape of a larger responsibility. To translate, to witness, to hold a language that would not be used as an instrument of domination. He did not yet know the full nature of the sarcophagus activation, nor could he predict the way his own stubbornness would be undone in the small, humiliating steps of surrender. He only knew, with a confidence that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with calling, that he had been asked and that refusal was no longer the same as safety. When he arrived in Cairo, the air tasted of cardamom and dust. The city felt like a throat. It opened and swallowed him into a noise that was both modern and layered with 1,000 older noises. He made his way south. The plateau began to present itself as less of an object and more of a center line in a landscape of attention. Every stone seemed to carry an old instruction folded into the grain. The group that accompanied him was small and patient. There was a woman who taught music therapy, and who wept quietly at dawn when the light struck the capstone. There was a retired carpenter who had become a meticulous amateur archaeologist. There was a young man who recorded frequencies with equipment Dennis barely trusted, but who had an ear for pitch that made Dennis envious in a human way. They moved among stones like people entering the first notes of a long conversation. On the third day, in the thin, hot air inside a corridor that smelled of limestone and old oil, Dennis felt the cadence of events shift.
The blue light, when it arrived this time, was not only around him, but in the stone itself. The frequency rose. He touched a carved face and felt the stone respond, like a muscle flexing beneath skin. It was not magic. It was a system at work, latent but coherent. The alien said telepathically, "You will remember what mastery looks like. Then you will remember why it was set aside." He inhaled and tasted dust and the faint, sweet tang of resins. He knelt and felt the geometry hum under his knees. The sarcophagus waited ahead, not far, its lid an object of ordinary proportions and extraordinary promise. The group watched, respectful, some with cameras hushed away, others with hands folded. The old priest was present, steady as a pillar. Dennis stepped forward like a man walking into a place he had rehearsed without fully understanding the lines. He lay back inside the sarcophagus as one might lie back in a boat, and the lid settled. The chamber that enclosed him smelled of stone, of the breath of ages. Lights pulsed at the edges, like small stars in a bowl. The sound, 432, arrived as both a physical vibration and an inner architecture. Then something shifted. The lid was no longer only a lid, but an instrument that completed a circuit. He had expected silence. He had expected darkness. Instead, the chamber filled with an ordered set of impressions that moved like the careful steps of a teacher toward a student. Images, sounds, and then a voice that was not voice. The alien said telepathically, "Enter. Learn how a city sings and why it sleeps." His last thought before the inner arc tightened around him was not dread, but a small, clear gratitude, strange and shamefully grateful, to the long years of being dismissed. Those years had taught him to listen when no one else did. He felt his chest open like an instrument tuned to a particular note. Outside, the group waited. Inside, the circuitry hummed. The capstone caught a glint of sun and threw it into the chamber like a promise. He did not yet know the shape of what would come of this. He only knew that a man with a notebook and a tuning fork had been chosen, for reasons that combined prudence and accident, to be a witness and a bridge. He breathed and let the frequency move through him. The first surge of the chamber sequence reached him like the beginning of a song he had known as a child but could not name. It sought not to break him, but to realign him. He surrendered, as one surrenders to the tide when one knows how to float. Outside, someone struck the tuning fork, and the note traveled into the stone.
Inside, a memory in his muscles unfolded, a memory of carrying a block, of balancing weight with others, of the precise satisfaction that comes when stones click together in place. He smiled, absurdly, and then the corridor of images opened wider, and with it a new responsibility made itself felt. A responsibility not to prove or to win, but to tend what had been left. He breathed and let the frequency move through him. The first surge of the chamber sequence reached him like the beginning of a song he had known as a child but could not name. It sought not to break him, but to realign him. He surrendered, as one surrenders to the tide when one knows how to float. Outside, someone struck the tuning fork, and the note traveled into the stone. Inside, a memory in his muscles unfolded, a memory of carrying a block, of balancing weight with others, of the precise satisfaction that comes when stones click together in place. He smiled, absurdly, and then the corridor of images opened wider, and with it a new responsibility made itself felt. A responsibility not to prove or to win, but to tend what had been left.
He lay there, and the city began to teach him the syntax of attention. The syntax of attention unspooled in him like a language he had almost known all his life and then forgotten. Images no longer arrived as mere pictures, but as predicates. A stress on a seam of mortar, the way a passage breathed when a wind current struck a particular niche, the precise interval between two notes that steadied a lintel. He saw the city not as a map, but as a choir score, each block, each gutter, each threshold holding a tone that, when combined, made the place whole. The alien's presence was no longer a single voice, but a chorus of implication. It placed small tasks inside his mind, gentle, procedural directives that came without strain. Listen to the hollows, it suggested. Find the node behind the third column. Align 3 counts at the step. He understood these as one understands how to tie a knot after watching someone do it once. The hands knew before the words did. When he tried the first instruction, it felt like remembering how to breathe underwater. He moved his hands over the carved lip of the sarcophagus, felt grooves that were more than decoration. They were phase guides, ridges that shaped how sound ran along surfaces. He hummed, softly at first, an attempt to match the chamber's returning frequencies. And the hum found its place. The stone answered as though waking to a familiar lullaby. Light thinned and pooled along edges. A thin sift of air moved in a corridor he could not see. Outside, someone tapped the tuning fork again. The note threaded through the stone, and the chamber translated it into a modulation that ran like a current along the vaulted ribs. Dennis felt a wave of warmth at his stomach, a childlike steadiness. Memory folded into muscle, hands lifting a cornerstone with others. A joke traded under breath as sweat slicked the brow, the exact placement that made a wall stop leaking. The city taught him that attention was not abstract piety, but practical arrangement, an economy of small, precise cares. Images of people came next, not faces he had seen, but gestures. An old woman sweeping the doorstep at a particular hour. A group of boys skipping in a pattern that, if interrupted, altered the way children later learned a street. The alien's telepathic intonation, if one could still call it that, pressed no doctrine. It merely showed relationships, the cascading consequences of neglect or care. Why was it set aside, Dennis asked inwardly, more to the thing that taught him than to himself? A thought like a folded page replied, because those who built it left. They carried their songs away. Cities become quiet when their singers leave. You will learn to wake what sleeps and to hush what cries without measure. He realized with a sudden vintage ache that stewardship was not a title, but a series of practices. The chamber taught him a handful of them, a way to thread sound through masonry so that drainage moved where it ought, a cadence of knocks that reset a collapsed seam, a small hymn that closed the tiny microfractures between stone faces. He practiced, his voice braided with the hum, and the sarcophagus lid, instrument and hinge, recorded the gestures like a ledger. Time bent. An hour might have been a day. A memory might have been a future plan. The collection of impressions formed a kind of curriculum. First, sustain the seams that make public passage safe. Second, attend to the thresholds where people meet. Third, learn the intervals that let a city exhale at night without waking in pain. The alien's instruction never hardened into command. It remained a pedagogy, precise, patient, unadorned. Somewhere in the folds of his learning, a moral note unclipped itself. The city had been designed to be taught to those who would listen, and it demanded fidelity. It was not a tool for spectacle. It expected a responsible ear. Dennis felt the weight of that expectation as an honest burden, like a satchel held close to the body. He had been chosen because he listened. Now he would be chosen again each morning by the work itself. A ripple of anxiety threaded through him, small and human. If he could wake the city, who else could wake it? The thought arrived not as fear of enemies, but as the knowledge that responsibility attracts attention. Even as the chamber continued its patient tutoring, his mind conjured scenes of people arriving with agendas. Those who would wish to commodify, those who would want to document, those who would simply stare and never learn the care. He steadied himself by returning to the tactile instructions. He learned to place his palm flat against a seam and feel the directional bias of vibration, leftward, rightward, like reading a compass. He found a small node behind the third column, a rounded nodule of shale that, when cupped and sustained with a hum at a certain ratio, expanded a passage's resonance so that distant alleys cleared of stagnant wind. He practiced this until his body understood the rhythm: hum, hold, reinforce, release. Outside, a low murmur began to rise across the plateau. It was not loud. It moved like a tide that had only just noticed the shore. The music therapist pressed both hands to her face and sobbed quietly, not from sorrow, but from the peculiar rapture of recognition. The retired carpenter paced, struck here and there with a knuckle like a man tuning a violin, eyes bright with the exact joy of a tradesman who recognizes craft in the hands of another. The young man with the equipment, who had thought in frequencies and numbers, sat cross-legged and let the recordings fold into his lap, tears catching on the rims of his ears. The old priest, who had watched from the doorway like a column carved to support, did not move much.
His expression contained relief and fear braided into one. Relief that some old covenant between place and people might be honored again. Fear of what the unraveling of so many quiet threads would mean when ordinary curiosity met extraordinary power. When Dennis felt enough of the city's grammar to try a small external check, less to test himself than to affirm the lesson, he sang. The first attempt was nearly a whisper, a phrase he had learned in the sarcophagus, a modulation that matched the hinge pattern on the lid. The tuning fork outside matched him, and the resulting interference nudged the plateau's thin harmonics. It sounded to the group like a distant bell struck underwater. A gull wheeled above the plateau and dropped its call, startled into a new rhythm. Distant windows across the town flashed, light answering light, as if the city, no longer merely stone and street, but a lattice of practice, had registered a greeting and thrown it back. At one house, a dog lifted its head and whined, then settled. On the lip of the plateau, a small child stopped running and put a hand to the stone wall, leaning as if listening. The effect was modest, yet it carried the intimacy of proof. It was not dramatic enough to draw armies or headlines, but it was an unmistakable sign that the chamber's teachings translated into the world. Dennis felt the thrill of that continuity, how a closed lesson became an open practice, and the corresponding caution. Each gesture rippled outward. When the sarcophagus's interior dimmed and the teaching cadence reached a soft conclusion, Dennis felt a new clarity settle behind his ribs. He had not become master of anything grand, he had acquired a craft. He knew now where to place hands, when to sing, how to build small constellations of care that could hold a neighborhood together. He also understood that the city would continue to speak its secrets in slow, disciplined languages. He could not know them all, nor could any one person. The lid eased. Stone sighed as the final notes dissipated. Light met him, warm, exact, and his eyes adjusted to the familiar faces that leaned into the doorway of the chamber. The woman with tear tracks on her cheeks, the carpenter with nails under his fingernails, the young man with a camera that looked suddenly reverent, the priest with a handkerchief clenched in one hand. He climbed out like someone surfacing from an ocean of old instructions. The group did not applaud. They exhaled together, a single sound made of relief and wonder. The music therapist stepped forward first and pressed both hands to his chest as if to check a rhythm. The carpenter grinned with the slack patience of a man who had been proven right about the usefulness of careful labor. The young man handed him a recorder, not to capture a spectacle, but to carry a lesson. Dennis felt the earth under his boots differently now, as if each step was both an act and a question.
He looked at the plateau spread around them, the capstone, the lines of houses falling away, the narrow streets like ribs, and he felt, for the first time, the appointment that had been stitched into his shoulder by the chamber. He was not chosen to command the city, but to keep it singing. Words were not yet needed. The old priest cleared his throat, and, in the quiet that followed, said, "We will need to decide what to tell the others." The sentence hung between them like an unstruck chord. It implied counsels and consequences, choices about openness and secrecy, matters for which the sarcophagus had not prepared him. Dennis met the priest's gaze and felt the weight of the coming decisions fold into his newly taught hands. Far below in the town, lights blinked in an answering rhythm. A child laughed in a way that echoed a phrase the chamber had taught him. For a moment, the plateau felt like the hinge of a door. On one side, the slow and old discipline of tending. On the other, the restless, noisy world that would soon press to know what had happened. Dennis drew a breath. The city had taught him how to listen. Now it would ask him how to speak. He stepped from the sarcophagus toward the capstone, toward the place where sun struck stone and threw it like a promise, and he thought of the small, steady labor that must follow revelation, the patient work of teaching attention so that a place might stay itself. He turned to the group, and, with a voice that carried both the exhausted gravity of someone who had been given a tool and the cautious hope of someone who knew how to use it, said, "First, we learn in public, slowly. We gather the neighbors. We show them how to care." The priest's mouth tightened. The carpenter nodded. The music therapist wiped her face and, smiling through her tears, said, "And the songs?" Dennis looked back at the city, which, for its part, was already humming underfoot, a low and familiar noise that suggested both memory and invitation. "We teach them the songs," he said. They descended the corridor together, moving toward the mouth of the plateau where town and stone touched. At the threshold, Dennis paused and, almost involuntarily, sang a short phrase he had learned in the sarcophagus. It was a simple line, a pattern of intervals meant to steady a street. The sound traveled along the facing stones and spilled outward like a secret. And through the town's streets the phrase returned, altered by the particularities of each house, sweeter at one corner, more hollow at another. The young man lifted his recorder and wept quietly. The music therapist hummed along, harmonizing without trying. The carpenter tapped a gutter with his knuckles in measure. The priest, who had seen many things and expected fewer miracles these days,
folded his hands and listened as if prayer were simply another form of attention. From down in the town, a voice answered, a neighbor calling up a question that might have been curiosity or alarm.
Dennis stepped forward, the first emissary between the chamber and the world, and raised his hand as if to say both, "Wait," and "Come closer." He had learned how to wake a city. He had not yet learned whom it belonged to. He felt like a tightening cord, the inevitable choice that would soon unroll: to keep the practice small and communal, or to let its news spread, and with it all the messy necessities of outsiders. He did not know which path was wiser. He only knew that either way would require teaching, translation, and endurance. Behind him, the plateau sighed, a long, patient sound that might have been stone settling or a city recognizing its steward. Dennis stepped into the sunlight and toward the voices below, carrying with him the quiet ledger of the sarcophagus and the faint echo of a tune that would not leave him.